Hello all, welcome to this little video chat with Hans Berger, author of In Some Sense Innocent, that Xi Draconis Books has recently begun the process of publishing. Pre-orders are available now. Copies will ship January 7th. And we're just here to see what the author's perspective is on his book, get to know him a little bit, and maybe hopefully have an interesting conversation.
Fingers crossed.
I what did you say?
I said fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Yeah, absolutely. I am the editor of Xi Draconis Books, Patrick Barney, and yeah, those are your two personnel for this video. So Hans, the first thing I want to talk about is I'd like to know, in your own words, what your book is about regarding both plot and theme.
Okay. Well, as far as plot goes, it's about this guy who is in his mid-20s and lives alone in a house in a retirement community that he's house sitting periodically and then also living with his great aunt. He's very isolated. He doesn't really interact with a lot of people. And in the course of his work as a notary, meets a woman and develops a relationship, and he has some secrets and some parts of his personality that he's not particularly upfront about, and it causes some complication in the relationship and in his life in general. So
Okay.
that's what it's about at a plot level. I mean, I'm not sure how much where the line is for what's a spoiler and what's not. So I'm trying to be conservative there with how much plot information I give away.
Absolutely.
So thematically, it's about a few different things. The first thing that it's about is, as a writer, is the ways that changes in technology affect our sexual identities, or the way that we experience sex, or our ways of defining or connecting with our own sexuality. There's something that I read probably maybe a few months before I started writing this book about sneeze fetishes and about the movie. I can't remember what the name of the movie is, but there's this movie where there's a pandemic that wipes out, like a pandemic flu that wipes out a huge percentage of the population. And there was an article on a website about the online sneeze fetish community. And the debate that they had about whether or not it would be sexy to watch this movie, right? Because there is a lot of sneezing in this movie, but
oh, jeez. Excuse me. Go on.
But the context for the sneezing is an apocalyptic plague. And the book itself is not, of course, about sneeze fetishists, right? But that particular article really got me to think about the whole concept of a sneeze fetish as an identity, as a thing that you connect with people about, as a way of defining your relationship to the sexual experience. That probably couldn't exist before the internet. Or there might have been individual people who in isolation had that feeling, but it would be something that they probably never shared with anybody else, probably never thought about in the same level of depth that they would now. And that's kind of a silly example, obviously, but that's the kind of thing that interests me. And what the character in the book experiences is, I think, a more serious version of that.
Okay.
So that's one thing that's kind of the primary theme and plot engine, I guess, is the primary character is someone who has a sexuality that he and most people would perceive as being deviant.
Right.
And how does the experience of being that person, how is that different in the early 21st century as opposed to 20 years ago, 50 years ago?
Right.
So it's important to me as an author, I think, to try to tell stories, to try to find and tell stories that couldn't exist outside of a reasonably contemporary cultural and political moment. I don't, there, you know, like there's lots of historical fiction that I enjoy. There are lots of contemporary books that are set in the 60s or 70s or whatever that I think you can set something in an earlier time period and have it be thematically resonant. I'm not at all opposed to that, but as a writer personally, I'm attracted to things that arise from the peculiarity of our historical moment.
Okay, sure. That makes complete sense. Um, this idea of the sneeze fetish is super interesting when you bring it up, when you tell me about it. That that really informs my own reading of the book, because you're absolutely right. A sneeze fetish could not exist without the internet. It has to. A sneeze in and of itself is so ephemeral that the only way to kind of codify it as a value for a community would be with the onset of video technology. How
Right.
how unless you can preserve the sneeze somehow for people to enjoy whenever they want, there's no way for that proclivity to develop, really.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So that's super interesting. Now, that kind of makes me. My second question that I was going to ask you about was actually, could you elaborate on calling the intersection of sex and technology one of, or a main pathology of our age? And I would like you to elaborate further, but something um, that I'd like to understand a little bit more about is, so your book deals with not something not something that seems strange, but fairly innocuous, being sexually attracted to sneezes.
Right. Right.
Your book deals with rape, pedophilia, um, and things that we genuinely think of as sex crimes. Things where
And certainly not without basis. I mean, it's not. I don't think anything in the book is an apology for either of those things. What it's about is people who deal with attractions to pedophilia, people who deal with who have rape in their past, working to overcome that, working to find ways to live with that without hurting other people, without affecting other people. Uh, I mean, it's about people recognizing the darkest aspects of themselves and actively trying to overcome those and to be better people. And I think the role of technology in that is means to both as a means to be a better person, to overcome the darker impulses of yourself, and then also as kind of an accelerant in certain ways that in certain situations makes people more prone to giving into worse parts of their personalities. I mean, the quote that you're reading about the intersection of sex and technology being a pathology, I'm sure that I said that, but in retrospect, it does seem like I probably oversimplified my feelings about it.
mm-hmm.
At least within the context of the book, I think that the interaction of sex and technology, it's an amplifier in both positive and negative senses. It's something that amplifies it's something that offers more opportunities for people to improve themselves and to find communities of other people who are struggling to also improve themselves, to also live in society without harming other people. But then it's also something that offers certain other possibilities. So it's not so much that I don't think that the relationship of sex to modern technology is totally pathological, but I think that it is probably changing our relationship to sex and to sexual relationships in ways that we don't really understand right now, and
Absolutely.
probably won't understand until it's much too late to really respond to or compensate for those changes.
Sure.
And, this book, I don't think it even begins to, I don't think that this book pretends to be at all a comprehensive survey of those changes. But it's one kind of smaller corner of a broad universe of stories that could be told about the same change that's going to happen or has happened, will continue to happen.
Okay. Yeah, that makes complete sense. It's and I definitely think that idea is an interesting one. That technology is kind of on both ends of the spectrum when it comes to sexuality. On the one hand, it for the characters in your novel, on the one hand, it operates to help curb and in some ways offer a support system for urges that are not neither healthy nor moral. But
Right,
but on the other hand, while it on the one hand it curbs them, on the other hand it can kind of augment them or facilitate them or enable them in some ways.
right, right.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah. Okay, cool. Um, so another thought I had is, so far we've been talking about sex and technology, and viewers are kind of aware by now that a little bit that the book is delving into some topics that are genuinely disturbing, and I think
Sure,
the
sure.
novel is disturbing. You know, I've read it 2 or 3 times now, and it's interesting because the even this last time that I read it, reading certain parts of it and still feeling that same sense of shock and disturbance as I did the first time. And yet, despite the fact that it's disturbing, it's also hilarious. It's a super funny novel. Um,
Thank you. Thank you.
so can you speak to that? Like, how does the humor break up this disturbing aspect, or how does the humor? What does the humor serve in the novel?
Well, I don't really. It's going to sound kind of strange, but I reread it when I was doing the final edits not too long ago, and I hadn't read it in a couple of years.
Oh, really?
I finished the version that I sent to you years ago that you read when you first read it. I probably finished that version in, I would say, at the end of 2014, mid to late 2014, and that is the last time that I had read the book, honestly, until I sat down to try to do like a final edit for the version that I sent to you.
Right.
And I remembered it as a very humorous book, partly because all the people who had read it, that was one thing that they talked about. But, going back through it now, it didn't strike me as funny in the same way that I remembered it being. And I know that that's the response everyone has had to it that read it. I mean, you're maybe like the fourth or fifth person who read it, and everybody has responded to the aspect to the fact that there is some humor in it. I would imagine that if people didn't find it funny, it would be pretty insufferable. As you pointed out, it's a fairly dark book, but I don't think that I think that the things that are the things that come across as humorous, I think, are entirely accidental.
Hmm.
What happened was that I sat down to try to create and then tell the story in the most honest way that I could, and a lot of what came out of that strikes people as humorous. And I think if that happens, it's not so much because I consciously tried to put humor into it as that really almost everything in life is funny in one way or another. And humor is built into every experience we have, every interaction that we have. So I think if you try to relay an honest story about people behaving in the world as people do in a way that feels emotionally real, for me, it's very hard to think that there wouldn't be some humor in how that comes out, because otherwise I don't think it would be an accurate portrayal of human experience. And I don't think I've ever written anything good that was consciously trying to be funny. I've written things that were consciously trying to be funny, but they're things that, in respect, were horse shit. Um, the the I think humor tends to arise naturally from the urge to express genuine emotion,
Hmm.
which sounds kind of cynical when you put it that way. But
No, I'm
well,
in absolute agreement.
I suppose there are lots of great books that aren't really funny. Uh, you know, Lots of Margaret Atwood isn't really particularly humorous at all, and she's very good. Um, but I don't think that I could write
I mean, I
without.
feel like Margaret Atwood intentionally tries to be funny with her like sarcastic little voice and whatnot. I'm not a huge Atwood fan, but you know,
Sure, sure.
but I no, I do absolutely agree that the funniest things are arrived at by accident, and maybe what you said, like if the book's not funny, then the disturbing nature of it makes it insufferable. Maybe that's all that matters, like if we're really trying to understand, as you said, the intersection of between sex and technology, and we're trying to understand these personalities and urges that otherwise disgust us, then it seems like we would need humor to kind of, I guess, make it easier, make it not as violent feeling. I don't know.
I think that's a fair point. I mean, I don't think that it would be. I think that if there weren't some aspect of humor, the darkness of the book would probably be a bit overwhelming.
Hmm.
It just wouldn't work aesthetically if there weren't some humor in it, because it wouldn't have as much color as it does.
Right.
So I'm glad that readers have found humor in it. I'm certainly glad that it has made the book more palatable. At the end of the day, it's something that was done accidentally or spontaneously on my part, and that's part of why I'm glad that people read it humorously, because uh, I wasn't trying to make that happen, so I'm really glad that it did.
Right. That I like how you're like make it more palatable. I mean, we're speaking as if I think it's a great book. Otherwise,
Sure,
I
sure.
wouldn't have wanted to put time and money and effort into bringing it, publishing it, and like I think it's more than palatable. I think it's an excellent novel.
Well,
Um,
thank you.
and
And yeah, I hope the interview doesn't. I hope it doesn't. I hope our promotional interview doesn't just come across like a big warning sticker.
Right, absolutely, that'd be horrible.
Don't worry, it's funny.
I don't know. Like, on some level, I don't want to compromise at all, and that's something
Hmm.
that is actually, I think, a character flaw of mine. Uh, like I look at the state of literary publishing, and it all just kind of disgusts me, and I think
Hmm.
it's just either these small presses that are supposed to be um, dedicated to art for art's sake. They really care about our names, and I can't find a single. I've never found a single press that had a mission similar to Kai Draconis's. That that wants to do something, to kind of address the many problems that the world has. And
Right.
so all I'm saying is, some people from our conversation will be turned off, but part of me is just like, I'm gonna publish this really awesome book that is, I think, very truthful about an aspect of our culture that more people need to recognize,
Hmm.
and to hell with people who don't like it. And that's the part of me that doesn't want to compromise. Another part of me is
Fair
like,
enough.
that's you're not going to sell many books that way, you know.
Well, yeah, I mean, I wasn't able to get any mainstream publishers on board with it,
Right.
certainly.
Which
Or, I mean, it never got to the publisher level, but I wasn't able to get any agents to feel like I wasn't able to get any agents to fall on the sword of this particular novel. So.
Excuse me, I'm a little ill. Um, so you mentioned Margaret Atwood, and I'm not necessarily uh, I don't know if she's an influence of yours or not, but it seems like a decent enough segue to say, are there
Sure.
what writers would you say have influenced you? Who are your favorite writers? What?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, go on.
Well, one thing that I've mentioned in relationship to this book is Russell Banks.
Right.
He wrote a novel in particular called Lost Memory of Skin that was about a convicted sex offender living in essentially a transient camp for convicted sex offenders in Florida. And I read that and was really, really enjoyed it, was really moved by it. And I think also was struck by the the humanity of it, the humanity and compassion of taking that on as a subject matter. And I really appreciated that, and that's something that was an inspiration to the fact that he wrote that and published it to at least a reasonable amount of attention was one of the things that encouraged me in sitting down to try to do this book. So that I'm a major debt of gratitude there. Another thing that I thought about, another author that I've thought about is Mary Gateskill.
Mm-hmm.
She's somebody else who has, she's written about deviant or so-called deviant sexuality, again in a very rounded human way, where she writes characters who are three-dimensional people, but who also have unconventional sexualities or sex lives, and is very good at it. Does it with also, I think, a certain amount of light touch and humor that has the same kind of uses humor, I think, as a leavening device in some of the same ways that I try to. So I don't know that those are. I don't know that either of those people are influences on a craft level, but the courage of the courage of their convictions that they have in choosing their subjects and in the way they deal with their subjects um, was very inspirational to me.
Okay.
Uh, as far as just personal favorite authors, I'm a big Don DeLillo fan. I mean, that's kind of anybody who's personally acquainted with me, that's like the kind of the go-to for my favorite author.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know that anybody would say that this book is particularly DeLilloian, but reading him really gave me a sense of the possibilities of fiction and the possibilities of prose. And so there's a huge depth there, of course. I was reading a lot of Martin Amis actually when I was doing the last couple of versions, when I was really putting the final meat on the bones of this particular novel. And again, I don't know if a reader would come away from it thinking, "Oh, that was Martin Amis-esque." But there's a certain kind of his classic work, his late '80s, early '90s things like London Fields. There's a complete and total zest that he has in the act of writing that is really, really contagious to a reader. And I think my own book is relatively subdued stylistically,
I agree.
but that kind of that the mischief that he has as a prose artist was something that I was very, very moved by and tried to kind of sneak into the work that I was doing as much as I could without it being distracting. So,
Okay. All right. I don't know if there's much to recap there. I mean, it all makes pretty much good sense. I mean, I do think it's interesting that I love your novel, and most of those writers I have never read, and uh,
you've never read or you actively dislike.
yeah,
I think
yeah, like
we were in a class together in grad school. I think you had to read 4 DeLillo novels. You
yeah.
only liked
Oh
one.
man, DeLillo's torture to me. I mean,
Yeah,
I absolutely share his political views. So like I remember Cosmopolis, and like actually there is one part of Cosmopolis where the satire breaks in the limo, and that the one woman character is like, I don't know what's going on, and like
hmm.
like it's totally, you totally understand that like corporate capitalism and oligarchy is responsible for these horrible things, and I like that, but it's something about like his sense of irony or something. I don't know. I just like I don't think he's that funny.
Right, right.
And but
Well,
regardless, it's
and
interesting that either I've never heard of what you like, or I actively dislike it. Yet I love your novel. But you know,
yeah.
um, so excuse me. So since the as we touched on before, Kai Draconis is uh, kind of interested in publishing literary works that are concerned with social justice, and you know, um, certainly your novel's not necessarily talking about oligarchy or whatever, but I definitely think there's a social justice aspect, that it is a socially conscious novel. So, can you
Mm.
speak to how you feel about that, or did you have any goals, social justice goals with the novel?
I don't know that I had any. I don't know that I was trying to write a polemic or trying to write something that would change anybody's minds or move a particular issue in a particular way. There's something that you were saying earlier about, and this might have been even before you were recording, but you and I were on a couple of the occasions when you and I have talked about the novel. You've mentioned that a lot of the characters are pedophiles or rapists,
Mm-hmm.
but there's an attempt to render them still as complex human beings and as people who have their own struggles. And um, I don't I don't know that it's a that's a very difficult thing to think about in the context of social justice
Right.
or I don't want it to seem like it's a, justice for rapists novel.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
That's not the goal at all. And I don't think that, I mean, if you were to ask me to boil the novel down to like a particular cause or idea, I don't think that I could do that.
Right.
And but I mean, I think at the most fundamental level, the one of the basic functions of fiction is to try to develop rounded identities and full human consciousnesses for people who are as remote as possible, as alien as possible, maybe as unpleasant as possible to or from both the reader and the author. I mean, there are lots of people in this book that I certainly wouldn't want to be around in person, or that I, would be repulsed by on a personal level. But the 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 goal of good fiction, I think, one of the goals of good fiction, one of the marks of good fiction, is that urge to bestow human consciousness on uh, people who have that kind of distance from you and who inspire that kind of repulsion. And I do think that probably there's a moral component to that urge. I don't think that in sitting down to write the book, there was necessarily a moral impetus to what I was doing. I mean, I think that more than anything else, it was there was kind of an exercise and a personal challenge to it. Can I render this effectively? Can I render these people effectively? I think that if I had set out to really make a social or moral statement with the book, it would have been very difficult to write, I think. And it certainly would have come out as a very different book. So I don't know that inevitably there's going to be a social component to how people read it or respond to it. I don't know that I'm comfortable presenting it as something whose foremost purpose is making any kind of a social point.
Right.
I think that I tried to approach the writing of it in some ways as bloodlessly as possible. I think that I really tried to my priority in writing it was to try to create a well-rounded and satisfying story, and anything that happened beyond that, I think, was to some extent a happy accident. So I don't know. It's in some ways maybe it's a bit of a challenge to the reader, I think, to try to develop a full social or moral idea from it. I don't know. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I mean, I think part of the issue is that maybe my question is framed incorrectly. Um, certainly, I assume when most writers write, and even when I write my own work, and and usually social issues and social justice are foremost on my mind, I'm still thinking, well, I want to write an interesting, satisfying story that humanizes a person in some way.
Right.
So uh, I do think like the idea of having a social justice goal, like I'm gonna get people to understand about climate change or something like that. That's not really exactly what I mean. and that's maybe why I like the term socially conscious a little bit better,
Right.
because it means that you're, as a writer, you're obviously aware of social justice issues, but that's not necessarily the, you're not thinking like I'm gonna have some political or social result from this novel.
Sure. Sure.
um so when I'm saying socially conscious, what I think is socially conscious about the book is taking a set of characters that typically we would all just deride and throw away as, disgusting perverts, and humanizing them is
Right.
is
Right.
is is what I would say is socially conscious about the book. And um, what I like about the book is that, on the one hand, it acknowledges that these characters are perverted, are disgusting, but it
Mm.
also, says, and a lot of them, or at least some of them, realize this, and as moral human beings try to work against it. Um,
Yes. Yes.
so that's what I'd say is, to my mind, the socially conscious aspect of the novel.
Yeah, that's actually a really good way to put it. You honestly summed that up much better than I did. But I think that that's an excellent summation of it. That the yeah, that it takes a set of people who it certainly doesn't shy away from acknowledging that many of the characters in the book are awful or perverted, or that things that they've done in the past have had really negative consequences.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it makes the effort to see them as people who are trying to overcome their own flaws. I'm just repeating what you said now because it was
No,
very articulate.
that's
I
fine.
liked it. So, and one thing I think that I might have, one thing that I struggled with when I was writing the book and thinking about the book and coming to it again later as a reader is the question of, is it harmful or unwise to be focusing on the stories of perpetrators rather than uh, victims, for lack of a better word? Is it socially irresponsible to highlight the experiences of the negative actors in a sex crime rather than should the stories of the people who survived those be uh, of greater consequence? Do they actually deserve greater attention? And is it socially irresponsible of me to, when given the opportunity between A and B, to not choose to not choose to focus on the
Mm-hmm.
experiences of people who survived those? And I don't necessarily have a good answer to that, except that uh, on an artistic level, the focus that I chose, there was more challenge to it.
Right.
Artistically, there was more challenge to it. Aesthetically, there was more challenge to it. And, finding that kind of sympathy and humanity in myself as a person responding to those characters was more difficult. And as much as anything else, that's what ended up um, being what attracted me to the choice that I made about how to frame the novel.
Right. I think that's an interesting question. My gut instinct is that it's not socially irresponsible, but to focus a novel, a piece of fiction, on, perpetrators of terrible crimes. Um, it But I also don't know exactly why.
Right, right,
Like, I have this gut reaction that, you know, um, certainly the stories of the victims are relevant, important, probably, and, maybe I shouldn't even say probably, maybe I should say most definitely they are more important than
sure.
those of the perpetrators. But that doesn't take away the fact that, if we hope, if we hope to reduce sex crime, then we certainly have to understand the sex criminal.
Right.
And it reminds me of uh, what's his name? Interesting philosopher guy who wrote "Why I'm Not a Christian." Russell, what's his name? I love him.
I don't know. Bertrand?
What?
Russell Bertrand?
Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell.
Bertrand Russell.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm a big fan of
I
Bertrand
got that
Russell,
inverted.
and in his long essay, "Why I'm Not a Christian," he talks about um, uh, disease, and he says, when we treat a disease, we don't go to the patient and look at the virus or the bacteria under a microscope and say, "You're evil, you're disgusting, how dare you live like a bacteria or a virus." We just do our best to cure the person of the disease. and
Sure.
and and that's something that I was thinking about a lot while reading the novel. These are people with um, these are people who have some type of pathology, some
Mhm.
type of mental pathology, and there's got to be a way to rather than going to them and saying, you are disgusting, perverted deviants, and we're going to put you in prison so that you can also be raped. Um, why don't we approach it more systematically? Why don't we say, well, how do we cure this pathology? I guess.
Well, you're doing a much better job of defending my book than I am, actually. All my defenses are coming from an aesthetic standpoint, and you're defending it from a moral standpoint, which is
Well,
quite
that's just
handy.
that's just
So,
my personality. Like all
sure, sure.
I have these, as I've said to you, I have these tendencies to like get into these moral soapbox things, and I don't know. I probably shouldn't do that, but anyway, okay. So let's talk about are you working anything new? Are you still writing?
Uh, no, not right now. I mean, total honesty, I don't know if maybe this will get cut out of the interview. I'm not really sure. I don't know if this is something we want to say in promoting it, but I wrote this and I finished the first really almost finished draft in maybe April 2014 and did some revisions over the course of 2014. And then toward the end of 2014, the beginning of 2015, beginning to middle of 2015, spent a fair amount of time shopping it around to agents. I looked up the process of agent hunting on the internet. I found all the information I could about finding agents. Did as much of that as I was able to figure out how to do. Made a list of all the agents I was able to find who were real agents, who were reasonably reputable agents, who were currently accepting literary fiction, and queried them all, and didn't really get anywhere with it. And that was kind of, once I figured out that wasn't going to happen, I really kind of hit a wall as a fiction writer.
Sure.
This was it. The writing of this book really only took me, even by the broadest way of counting, it maybe took me a year to write. But it was the product of 6 or 7 years of working on other things to get to a point where I could write this. And this felt like, when I decided that I wanted to be a writer, this felt like the thing that I wanted to do. And when I finished it, I sat down and I said, okay, like this is this was the goal from a creative standpoint, was to make this thing. And when I wasn't able to get anywhere with it commercially, I didn't have any idea for a next step, because it just didn't feel at that point like there were any stories left that I wanted to tell. I had told the story that I'd been trying to tell, and nobody really seemed interested beyond some of my friends. And so I just honestly at that point I gave up to some extent on the idea of being a fiction writer in any meaningful sense. I pretty much have just been writing songs for the last 3 years.
Okay.
And none of those are actually publicly available, so I can't even cross promote anything by saying that. But I don't think that I've written a line of prose fiction since mid 2014. Honestly,
really?
Yeah.
That makes me sad.
Well, it makes me sad when I think about it,
Yeah.
but I just didn't know at some point. I didn't realize. I wasn't really sure what I was writing for, because when this book, when I wasn't able to get anywhere with this book commercially, it became very hard to sustain the illusion that I was writing for any reason other than just to print a copy out and stick it in a fireproof safe and then
Right.
go to my 9-to-5 desk job every day. And I don't know. So, and I wish that there was some kind of happy ending to add to that.
We're publishing your book.
There is, there is. You're publishing the book, and that really has meant a lot to me. I mean, that was I had set it aside. I had set this particular book aside as a failed project, and so it's been very hopeful to me. It's been very inspiring to me. It's been very exciting to me to know that it is actually going out in the world. So, I don't know that once I get all these songs written, then maybe I'll sit down and
all right. I mean,
try to think about writing some fiction again.
I've definitely been where you are, and in fact, that it's kind of the impetus behind creating this book press.
Right.
I've come up against my own like publication wall, and it's a really frustrating experience. It really tears you down emotionally, and you kind of think you really feel like in some way like a failure, but I have always known that I've wanted to, creative writing has always been a part of my life, and I wanted to keep it a part of my life. So that's kind of the impetus behind this book press, and I hope that seeing your work in print gets you back on the writing track. I'd love to read more of your work.
I would too.
Yeah, sure. All right, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed the antics of Mr. Burger, and I hope that you enjoy his book when you purchase one. See you later.
Thank you much for your time and attention, and thank you, Patrick, for publishing my book.
My pleasure.